F1's first race in the US this season was certainly a who's who of celebrities on the grid, and it was a fantastic victory for Verstappen after a safety car spiced up the action. But was it really the great racing that they were hoping for in Miami? Well, there's a lot to talk about, so here's my 5 things we learned from the Miami Grand Prix. My name's Andy, and this is Behind the Drive. Verstappen doesn't need practice. I want to give Verstappen a specific mention this week, not just because of his race victory, but also for the fact that he managed to achieve third on the grid despite having just 15 laps of running on Friday, of which only 4 or 5 were actually at top speed. He was suffering with a hydraulics issue throughout FP1 and FP2, which meant his car was overheating, and he was unable to complete much practice at this brand new circuit. The fact that it's a street circuit, and the fact that it was a pretty tricky one that saw a number of drivers making mistakes, it was really impressive to see Max able to push it to the limits in qualifying. He'd clearly put in a good amount of time in the simulator, as he was still giving it everything in the first runs of Q3 as he went on to provisional pole before making a mistake through turn 5 on his final run, which meant that he would start third. But for me, that's a mighty performance from the world champion, as he's proved that regardless of his practice running, he was able to push his Red Bull to the limits and have the confidence when the walls were so close. But this is yet another issue that Verstappen has faced in his Red Bull this year. It seems like he's had the worst of the bad luck in that team, and he struggled with DNFs at 2 races, and then this issue came at the worst possible circuit. It's something that he commented on in the media pen as he was frustrated by these problems that seem to be coming up for him at most of the weekends so far this year. It's something that could take his focus away from the job at hand, which is to beat Ferrari and Charles Leclerc. And that's exactly what he did in the race, as he got by Sainz around the outside of turn 1 on the opening lap, and then he got past Leclerc on lap 9. And from there, it looked as comfortable as it did in Imola, where he was comfortably the fastest car and well ahead of the Ferraris. Verstappen took full advantage of the speed that the Red Bull team have at the moment, and that's really the key advantage for them. This will most likely continue to be the case until Ferrari can add their final upgrades to their power unit. It was the speed advantage that kept Verstappen in the lead after that safety car, surviving the onslaught from Leclerc in the closing stages. But even under pressure, he looked comfortable, despite the fact that he didn't have that running on Friday. So it was a good weekend for Max Verstappen despite the reliability issues that affected him early on, and he was still able to get the maximum from his Red Bull this weekend, and as a result, he's once again closed the gap in the World Championship to Leclerc. So it's got to be a green box for Verstappen. FIA not listening to the drivers. Next up, I want to talk about the fact that the FIA seemed to not listen to the drivers when it came to safety this weekend. The Miami International Autodrome is a brand new circuit, and as such there were the expected teething issues when it comes to safety. The corner at turn 17 was resurfaced twice over the weekend on both Thursday and Friday evening as the surface was damaged. But also the drivers were disappointed with the surface more generally, with the grip seeming to be non-existent off the racing line. As such, the drivers weren't particularly optimistic when it came to the potential for a competitive race. But it was after an FP2 crash for Carlos Sainz at turn 14, where he had a pretty heavy impact into the concrete barrier, and then a further FP3 crash for Esteban Ocon at the same corner where he registered a 51G crash, which cracked his Alpine chassis and left him unable to compete in qualifying. Following these incidents, there were calls from the drivers to install a Tech Pro barrier or even a tyre wall at that corner to protect the drivers from these huge impacts, which obviously are not what we want to see in Formula 1. But it's the fact that reportedly the drivers' calls for more protection in this corner were ignored by the FIA that concerns me. Why wouldn't they at least respond to the drivers here? It's a corner that had suffered 2 big impacts before the race, so why take the risk of the drivers hitting the wall again during the Grand Prix? There were reports that suggested it wasn't possible to introduce a Tech Pro barrier midway through the weekend, as it would be impractical. This is debatable in my view, as they were willing to resurface turn 17, but maybe it would have been a challenge to get something new installed. But it was a risk that the FIA took when it comes to safety, which is something that in my opinion they shouldn't ever do. There were other reports that suggested that the FIA didn't want to put any pressure on the race organisers in Miami to make such short-term changes. I do hope that this has changed for the future races at this circuit, but it feels like they didn't do enough this weekend in responding to the crashes that happened during practice. So for me, it's a red box for the FIA, as they seem to be more interested in underwear and jewellery than the actual racing on track this weekend. Before we take a look at whether Ferrari made a mistake on Sunday, I want to take a moment to ask you to consider subscribing to Behind the Drive. I'm aiming for 50,000 subscribers by the summer break, so if you haven't already, do consider subscribing. Thanks. A strategy error from Ferrari. It was difficult for Ferrari on Sunday after a 1-2 finish in qualifying, but they both ultimately ended up well behind Verstappen on track until they were gifted an opportunity to get a tyre advantage with the late safety car. Verstappen missed his chance to get a cheap pit stop due to the timing, and there was a real chance for Ferrari to pit at least one of their cars onto the soft or medium tyres to have a go at competing with Verstappen on his old hard tyres. It feels like a missed opportunity for them, as they could have so easily had an advantage over the Red Bull. Meanwhile, it was Red Bull that did seize the opportunity to get a set of medium tyres onto Perez's car, and that gave him a chance of getting past the Ferraris ahead of him, despite the fact he was nursing a power unit issue. He did fail to achieve that in the end after a mistake into turn 1. This was clearly the best strategy call at the time though, as the safety car was the only thing that could give this race a bit of excitement, but I just don't quite understand why Ferrari didn't at least give Leclerc a chance. It was an awesome battle towards the end of the race, as the Ferrari was right on the Red Bull's tail throughout the closing stages, as he was always within the DRS range. If he had that grip advantage on top, he could have surely got that move done. You could see the extra pace that the drivers that stopped had. Russell was a great example, as he managed to make up 2 positions in those closing stages. So it feels like a mistake from Ferrari, as they didn't risk it in my opinion. So for me, that's a red box for the Italian team after they failed to beat Verstappen today from their own mistake. Mercedes showing positive signs. Mercedes next, and it was this weekend that seemed to show signs of huge improvements, with George Russell topping the times in FP2. This was somewhat unexpected, with the team bringing upgrades to the front wing end plates, the rear wing and the beam wing, as well as some small changes to the floor. But the drivers were not expecting these to be groundbreaking, and when it came to the race they probably weren't. However, there were glimpses of brilliance as they showed some strong pace on Friday. It was suggested that the team did well with the tyre warm-up in the hotter conditions in Miami, with track temperatures over 50 degrees at times. And this clearly played into the team's hands, combined with lower downforce setups, meaning all teams were suffering less with the porpoising than at previous Grand Prix. But at the same time, there were signs that the car was still unpredictable, with George Russell's qualifying performance showing that the car could suffer from snaps of oversteer unexpectedly. As a result, he would start P12 to Hamilton's P6, which isn't too far off where you'd expect the Mercedes to be based on this season so far. In the race, there were certainly signs that Mercedes were able to be competitive with the midfield. Hamilton lost positions at the beginning of the race after a lock-up into turn 1 as he got stuck behind Sergio Perez, but it didn't take him long to get back past Fernando Alonso and Pierre Gasly, who was uncomfortable looking overtakes through the DRS zones. Meanwhile, after a shaky-looking start for Russell, once his hard tyres warmed up, he was able to make good progress. Russell was proving how much life he could get out of those hard tyres, with a strategy that played into his hands with that safety car. As a result, Russell managed to continue his consistent top 5 finishes that he's managed to achieve at every race this year, with Hamilton a single position behind. So whilst it isn't what Mercedes will want, it seems like some of these upgrades are taking the Mercedes team in the right direction, and if they keep this up, then you never know, Mercedes could be right back at the fight at the front. So overall, I'm going to give them an amber box for the Miami race, as it was a great recovery and promising signs for them, but they are still just off the pace of those 2 teams ahead of them. Valtteri Bottas continues to impress. I think Bottas might just be the most confident driver in Formula 1 right now. Last time out in Italy, he achieved 5th position in his Alfa Romeo, and he matched that with his qualifying performance in Miami. It was then quite a lonely race for him as he ran 5th throughout the first stint and ended up sandwiched between the 2 Mercedes cars towards the start of the second stint. But the safety car didn't help Bottas this weekend, as he ended up at risk from Russell, who got a cheap pit stop, and then Hamilton, who was able to close up to the Alfa Romeo. In the end, he got 7th this weekend, as he lost out to both Mercedes driver after a mistake at the penultimate corner, but it was still a best of the rest finish for Bottas, as there were no retirements from the top 3 teams in Miami. It's another great finish from the Finn, who seems to be flying since his move away from the Mercedes team. Maybe a multi-year deal is all he needed after all. For me, I think Bottas is clearly deserving of a green box for another solid performance building on a very strong season. Honourable mentions. At one point in this race, I was struggling to think of any bonus points. But here we are, and that safety car brought out so many more talking points from this race. Alex Albon definitely deserves a shout out for what was another point for Williams after a great strategy. Esteban Ocon also lost out on Saturday after he failed to even qualify after that huge crash I mentioned earlier. But a clever strategy and the fact that he kept it clean meant he managed to get all the way to 8th in his Alpine car, ahead of his teammate who had a pretty messy afternoon in the USA. And then, sadly, Mick Schumacher failed to achieve his first points due to a mistake as he lunged into turn 1, making contact with Sebastian Vettel. It was deemed to be an incident that required no further action, but it feels like an unforced error that cost Schumacher once again. For me, as I mentioned in my video earlier this week, I think Schumacher really needs to start showing signs of improvements if he wants to keep his spot on the grid long term. So it was a race that wasn't too exciting until that late safety car, but it was certainly a spectacle in Miami with the strangest podium setup I think I've ever seen. But we saw a great battle between the two title contenders once again, so it was clearly an interesting one, if nothing else.